right, let's try Professor John Stremblau, who's joining us on the line to talk about, of course, Donald Trump's statements and remarks to, of course, North Korea and trying to, of course, test those weapons. Professor, a very good afternoon to you. Donald Trump has made some very strong statements on how to handle North Korea. Is this openly declaring war, don't you think?
No, it's hard to figure out what exactly his words ever mean. He's said this before many times. Sound and fury, it's going to be the annihilation of North Korea, refusing to note that the risks that he put South Korea on and the entire international community. I wonder how many of those people assembled at the General Assembly took those words seriously, especially when they heard the very statesmanlike speech of the Secretary General just before Trump spoke. The Secretary General Gutierrez, he was very clear that North Korea does pose a risk, but there are ways for dealing with that risk other than the sound and fury of Donald Trump's rhetoric.
Professor, Donald Trump calls Kim Jong-un a rocket man who's on his own mission. How will these current tensions then between the U.S. and North Korea impact on the world and even South Africa in general?
Well, I think South Africa and all other countries need to pursue a sensible course of multilateralism. Trump also condemned Iran and the Iranian deal or the climate change agreement is a sign of the new kind of willingness of states to try to find a common way forward. What is concerning to me about the UN speech as an international relations professor is that I think Donald Trump was talking to his conservative base within the United States, and the problem there is that the world is more complicated than American domestic politics, however complicated those may be, and for him to try to reassure his domestic right-wing faction that his recent compromises with the Democratic Congress does not threaten his main simplistic view of America first and America asserting its military power rather than its diplomatic skills and its pluralism being an asset rather than white ethnic nationalism that is Donald Trump's hallmark. That's very concerning to me because then the United States is not a responsible stakeholder.
Professor, if I can just prick your brain there, why the need to ban any nuclear weaponry activity in our regions? Are there absolutely no benefits of storing and producing such weapons, not for actual usage, but for security purposes?
No, you're absolutely right. And here South Africa really is an example to the world of voluntarily giving up its nuclear weapons because it recognizes that these have no military utility. This is hard for an American to understand who's lived through the Cold War, where deterrence probably did spare the world a catastrophe, even though they came very close to a catastrophe in the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962. But we're in a much more pluralistic and diverse world. Nuclear weapons are of no value to anyone. They ought to be abolished universally. But giving up those weapons by the 5 nuclear powers, not to mention now Pakistan, India, North Korea, is a very real challenge. That's why I thought that the multilateral agreement for containing the Iranian nuclear arsenal was a very positive way forward because Iran is a complicated and important nation and is willing to negotiate, I think, some of this. Now, it has to be verified. But there is a political way forward. The Trump rhetoric points only to the military solution.
But, Prof, why is Trump then criticizing the nuclear deal that was signed by the 6 other countries? We know that there was a prohibition treaty that was also signed this afternoon, not a short while ago. What are your assertions on that?
Well, you're asking me to make sense out of someone who is really totally inexperienced, incompetent, and prone not to thinking very deeply about the questions that he's addressing. Contrast him, for example, to the way Obama dealt with Iran in a very deliberative, inclusive way, putting together a complex coalition, being a good partner. Donald Trump just does not function that way. It is extremely difficult for me or for other leaders to put myself in the shoes of a demagogue. He came to power in the United States through Koreans have been playing through appealing to a narrow base, and that's the story. And it makes international relations quite unstable. But I'm hoping that the domestic politics in the U.S. will contain Trump. That's really where the action is in the American domestic struggle to deal with Donald Trump.
But, Prof, look, let me just pick your brain once again before I let you go. Do you think that there are deep-rooted issues that haven't come to light when it comes to why North Korea is hell-bent on the production and even testing of these nuclear weapons? Could there be some provocation from anywhere that we are not aware of, or it's just little Kim's obsession to produce and test these weapons, sir?
Well, you have to look at the history of the Korean Peninsula and the Korean War back in the 1950s. North Korea has very little going for it, but it did inherit a regime which is very autocratic. South Korea now is a great economic success story and a democracy. It didn't have U.S. occupation. This is a complex story, but the North Koreans are as poor as any African country, but they do have enough science and have been given by their Chinese. China worries about a united Korea Peninsula. China has real stakes in not being confronted by what it regards as a threat in the Korean Peninsula, and it sees the alliance with North Korea up to this point as an asset. Now it's becoming a liability for China. But if you're Kim Jong-un and you want to survive in office, you really have very few tools to rely on against a much more successful South Korea and being surrounded by countries that are going increasingly capitalistic.
Absolutely, yeah.
It is really his last effort to contain his own regime. And my feeling was, let it evolve out of existence the way the Cold War ended with Russia and Soviet Union evolving out of existence, and more democracy prevailing eventually, although it's still a long way to go in Putin's Russia.
Professor, thank you so much for that sound analysis, and thank you so much for joining us here on News Today.